Hello everybody. So I'm going to try and do three things, hopefully fairly quickly, because actually I think the conversation in the room is, as ever, the most interesting. So to first try and answer the, obviously slightly false question about globalness, then talk a bit about whose responsibility is it to do stuff, and then really to share some of the thinking about, from an open knowledge perspective, about the privacy versus open thing, and what does that actually mean, and where would we, if we get involved in this debate, it's not something we've historically been in, where might the intervention points be, at least from an open perspective, if not from an open knowledge perspective. So, is this truly global? Well, as we as a panel are demonstrating, no! But, just to try and unpick that a little bit, that's, I think, that's on the data production side, the globalness, where is data being produced, where is it being used, where is it being abused. This is obviously personal data in this context. Where's the legislation, where are the impacts, where's the discussion about this? All of those are also not global. And definitely not kind of equally distributed. And in some ways, it's similar to the work that we do on the Open Data Index. There are rankings and distributions of how unglobal these conversations are and where the differences are. What struck me, and I'm sort of riffing off your slides a little bit on this one, is we obviously know that internet access is profoundly unglobal, and then when you start to disaggregate at the lower level within those developing countries where there is access, there's another layer of inequality effectively on top of that. So richer people have far more access in those low-income countries. The mobile data issue, I think, is a really interesting one. Obviously, huge growth. That's much more dominant in the lowest income countries, and those are the ones we tend to work in Latin America and Africa less than in the Asian context historically, as Open Knowledge International, that is, which are your two smallest blobs on that one. But obviously, if you're operating off mobile data and you're using for personal data purposes, you've got an extra layer of lack of security that adds into that. So the insecurity associated with mobile data being a dominant use in those contexts, I think, is an interesting kind of additional layer on what you were talking about. What's clear is traffic is also incredibly unequal, and it obviously begs the question, when you saw that slide of what is the traffic, what proportion of that is porn? What is this actual traffic being used for would be fascinating. I mean, it's very hard data to get, but it would be. And what proportion of that is about person data about individuals would be particularly interesting in this conversation. The other one that is mirroring your slide, but where's the data held, is also clearly, almost from your blog, almost entirely the US, plus a bit in Europe, relatively speaking. Which in a sense gives a reason why we as a group of people in rooms like this have a huge, I'm jumping ahead, have a huge responsibility to look at the global implications of this debate. That's my punchline on the next section. I shouldn't have said that. The existence of laws. There's an actually really interesting shout. I'm just going to shout out here to the Web Foundation. They did a report last year looking at data laws and data protection laws in across the world. And they've just done a piece of work on Nigeria as well, which I haven't really got my head around, but looking at GDPR or their data protection legislation there and what's going on. But as you say, the implementation of those laws, I mean, we don't really know how GDPR is going to play out, right? And what will survive, let alone, and that is not a new problem for those of us coming from a development background, in our own country, the implementation of laws and the existence of regulators is clearly a really huge thing. And I think that would be the interesting next data set to get, perhaps from somewhere like a global bank perspective, is not just do the laws exist, but do regulators exist? Because there is a legal foundation to all of this, but can somebody implement that? Having a regulator as a starting point for that, because this moves so fast, you need the live derogation of duties to somebody like a regulator. Okay, so clearly this is a global problem. People have personal data across the globe. I think, stealing my own punchline from before, I think the reason why we, particularly in North America and Europe have huge responsibilities around not just thinking about how we work in the implications of our regulation, our engagement for our own countries, but actually for the world. So specifically things like the extraterritoriality clause in GDPR has not yet been explored, but has potentially huge power. So that for those of you who are not an avid reader of GDPR, I think it's section 64 or possibly 69. I can't remember. You see, I have a visual memory. It implies that anybody selling into Europe all European organisations, but anybody selling into Europe has to also comply with GDPR. The minute you put a euro transit, you can buy stuff in euros on your website, that is considered to have implications that you are selling it, you are intending to sell in, therefore you have to. How that's going to be enforced could have huge, interesting consequences for what happens on this kind of global version of the personal data debate. So, why is an organisation that has historically primarily worked on public data and the openness of public data in this space? And in some senses, and I don't want to talk for the MyData folks, but that logic between MyData, which is very much been a personal data conversation, what is its linkage and relationship to the open movement, the sort of open data questions? I was just reflecting slightly on the history of this conversation. We were very much set up as oppositional to each other in the early days. Open was seen as undermining privacy, and that we were demanding that all medical records were opened. And I think as a community we went, no, it's no harm, right? Same criteria as for FOIA, do no harm, only release stuff that is. And I think we probably for a while, as an open sort of sector, fell into a slightly comfortable ease with, there's no problem with privacy here. It's just actually, they're different sides of the same coin. And we just need to do privacy well and open everything else up that can be opened. Look, I'm obviously making this sound a bit trite, right? But I think we didn't think we were in contradiction with each other as movements. And I still don't think there is one. But I think, interestingly, coming back, and I think this kind of conversations in the last couple of days here have highlighted, we have to get deeper than that. That is not a satisfactory answer anymore. Probably wasn't in the first place. And to put it from an open perspective, that if we want to see a world in which you get the most use of data to form information, where you have egalitarian access to it, the vision that the open movement sets out about how people of all types can use information to exercise power, and that it should be a profoundly empowering view of the world. There is an issue. We know about how to open up data. We know from a technical perspective. We've written the software that most global publishing is happening from. We're making big plays into things about standards like the frictionless data work that we're doing. What implications does that have for personal data or data about me? And so some thoughts around that, which in some sense are, to be honest, a synthesis of where I've got to in the conversation, both internally in the last few days. One, that much as the name MyData is fantastic, it isn't my data. I don't own it really, and the ownership conversation is quite a dangerous one because you can't exercise that right, and because most of it isn't really isn't really about me. It very rapidly, even my name is used by thousands of organisations as an identifier. So me claiming my rights over my name, what does that actually mean? Let alone by the time you're talking about medical records or anything processed, where it's a much more complicated thing. And guess what? I think it's usufruct that we should be looking at. So the use rights agenda, how to and control is the language being used here a lot. Then I think there's this this is another kind of strand of this conversation, the data is oil, the commoditization of data. What does that really mean when my data is on that individually almost valueless? I mean, values are incredibly valuable to me, but it is only valuable in aggregate and at high levels of aggregation. And I suspect I'm a bit of a weird outlier in a bunch of things, so I'm probably even less useful. So, there's the ability to monetize this, and that agenda is all the power, and that comes from the collectivization. The value and the power comes in collectivization. And I think we don't have any decent economics on this at all at the moment. So these issues, and I'm laughing at the questions.
No, I see acronym. I told you, I gave you one.
User front. It's not my. Oh. Stop distracting me. So I think there's something about we need a better economic. I mean, I'd say this because I'm an economist, so I use that for intellectual frameworks. But I don't think, as a movement, we have a proper theory and grounding around why we think data and openness matter in the 21st century. So we had some logic about it, but there's something about potentially treating information as a means of production rather than as a totally different. This only makes sense to the economists in the room. But if you start to do that, it profoundly changes your theory about why it matters and how it matters. And I think we may need to put some more attention onto actually trying to figure out what the implications for that are, so that it's not just about reducing the transaction costs of markets, but is actually a factor of how markets operate. So this is me trying to persuade myself that open and these agendas need to be linked, and I'm persuaded myself at least that the open movement does have to play a role in the personal data debate, because of both technically and in terms of getting the best mechanisms for sharing data, which is where this openness agenda is at. We have things to say and we need to play a role. And that MyData is an incredibly important play in that area. So the very practical question that was implied in this is the collaborations required to do this, and you were also talking about those. I think helping, on the civil society side, helping MyData articulate a very clear role for itself, and so that the rest of us, and that they can lead us in how we shape the interaction between the open and the privacy debate. And I really see that this next step in MyData is an extraordinarily important moment in time where that framing needs to come from, and supporting that, because we have to join up. I think we have to join up these two conversations at a really proper technical level and start to answer the questions about how do you share what with whom, when, well, to get that to that open future that the open movement has a vision about how the world can be.